Hi, I'm Bob Norton, founder of...
Sorry, I didn't cut yet.
Okay. You want to cue me?
Yeah, I'll give you a...
Oh, I know.
You want me to just give you a countdown, or I can just point?
That's fine. Whatever works, yeah. Yeah, visually is fine, yeah. Hi, I'm Bob Norton, founder of AirTight Management. And this is an introduction and overview to a very elaborate training on AirTight Management. AirTight Management is the first ever proposed standard for the internal management systems of small to medium-sized businesses that was developed to handle the problem that entrepreneurs really don't know how to shift gears as a company goes beyond somewhere between 7 and 15 people. Typically an entrepreneur starts or continues to do things the way they did in a startup when they need to change their management style and install more systems to handle their growth. My own background is documented here. I started my career as a software engineer and quickly became a chief architect and then chief technical officer and vice president of engineering. Grew 2 companies to over $100 million in sales, and I've been a CEO since 1989. But for the last 10 years, I've been a CEO of a couple of companies that are dedicated to training and consulting and coaching with CEOs and entrepreneurs in small to medium-sized businesses. My other background, as you can see on the slide, is that prior to becoming a CEO, I spent a lot of time doing databases, information systems, and software for various industries, including Wall Street, the insurance industry, and quite a variety of other things. I also created the CEO Boot Camp, which is an intensive 2-day training for early stage entrepreneurs, and that's available on a 14 DVD set as well. Some of this material will overlap with that, about 10 or 20% of it will be the same, but AirTight Management is designed for companies that are at least 5 people already and probably starting to be 7, 10, or 12 people before you start to install these systems. Management science is both art and science, and there are many layers of it. Things that cannot be put into words easily, that come from experience and practice, fit into these layers. And so thinking about these layers and the philosophy and values and how that impacts business, there are many books written on this, great books that will provide you references that every CEO and entrepreneur should read. Language and models, the jargon of management and leadership. We're going to learn a lot about that and put more meaning behind it. And best practices in management that are standard things that have been figured out over the last 50 to 100 years that are generally the best way to handle things. Again, these may shift as a company gets bigger. And then something at the bottom of this level is processes and procedures, which tend to be more company specific. So we can't teach you what the processes and procedures are for your company, but we can give you the tools to develop those and to know what you need to develop in terms of systemization, automation, and various other things. This is a diagram of the 6 AirTight management systems, and the reason we call it AirTight management is because if you do all of these things well, you will have a closed loop system which creates what I call a Darwinian meritocracy. A Darwinian meritocracy is a company and a culture that adjusts as things change in the world, whether their market changes, outside forces, the size of the company. You're building a culture that's self-adjusting and will evolve and automatically correct for many things that are going on. And so it creates a closed and sort of infallible system if you do all of these things right. Each of these systems needs to be laid in to a company at a particular size, and we're going to give you lots of reference material to figure out when you need each of these things. But I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the 6 systems. Strategic planning is actually the most complex and hardest one that requires the most experience because it encompasses a very broad view of a vision of the company, a vision of the future, where the markets are going, and what you're building towards. So it includes things like doing competitive intelligence, doing market research, doing branding. It's really figuring it out. This is a fairly elaborate process that, as an expert, when I go into a company, it can take 6 to 10 full-time days to figure out the proper strategic plan. And a strategic plan becomes a living document that's adjusted, that has a lot of what-if scenarios and contingencies and gating points in it, so that if certain things happen, you go in one direction. It isn't just a single clear step. So that's one of the most elaborate processes, and for that reason, I generally recommend that people start by doing pieces of that to know where they're going, and that will evolve as the company gets bigger. Obviously, $1 million company does not need to spend $50,000 in figuring out what its strategic plan is. It's learning from the marketplace and adjusting. But once you're over $1 million in revenue, you should have an annual strategic planning process. And we also sell a full kit with about 140 different files on the disk that help, they're tools to help you through that strategic planning process. I do recommend hiring a facilitator, an outside person that isn't drinking the Kool-Aid inside for strategic planning. But our strategic planning module is a complete framework to help you and your team through that process, and it's meant to teach you to fish as opposed to being just a consultant coming in every year to update that. It's very important that the whole team understand that. The second module of AirTight Management we call for short PAMS, which stands for Performance, Accountability, and Merit System. That is a collection of best practices garnered from well over 50, maybe even 100 different management gurus of the last 50 to 75 years. One of my personal claims to fame is I've read over 1,000 books now on management, leadership, entrepreneurship, and business. And I like to say I've stolen all the best ideas of all the best management gurus, repackaged them and putting them into a trainable format in AirTight Management and the CEO Bootcamp, so that instead of you having to read 100 or 200 books, you can get all of the major principles and best practices from AirTight Management. So it's basically a recooked recipe of all the best ideas in a very structured and trainable format. And in PAMS, you'll learn 5 different styles of management that every manager and executive should know to be effective in growing a company. The third module in AirTight Management is called Dashboards, but it also includes the principles of KPIs, which is Key Performance Indicators or metrics of a business, and CANI, which is Constant and Never-Ending Improvement. Dashboards are the tool that allow you to move to an autopilot for the business and scale and back off your management to do other bigger, more strategic things as the business becomes systematized. It gives you trend indicators. It allows you to focus people on what needs to be done. It gives you early warning indicators of what's happening in your market and all kinds of other things that will be helpful to your business, and it's a massively powerful tool. As a matter of fact, it's a big strategic advantage to have the right dashboard. Most people don't know how to create a dashboard, and most of the software companies out there that sell dashboards are focused on the pretty graphs and the database of numbers from a computing perspective. What we can teach you as a small company is how to use just plain spreadsheets to track these and how to track the right numbers, because the magic and the impact is going to be in tracking the right things, which will give you a step-by-step process to figure out what those things are. Module number 4 is strategic budgeting. This is a strategic perspective on budgeting. Oftentimes companies let the CFO or the controller or the accounting department be the driver of budgeting. And that tends to have a cost-only approach instead of an entrepreneurial-driven revenue and opportunity approach. So this is a much more holistic approach to annual budgeting and, of course, updating it as you learn more quarterly or maybe even monthly in a very young company where there's a lot of learning going on. Module 5 is about process documentation. Any company that's getting ready to scale or has to grow quickly needs to document its processes either in flow charts or in other documents and be able to train those things and communicate them well, to have people on the same page and have the tools to train new people coming in. Otherwise, the intelligence base or the equity or intelligence in the business of the managers gets diluted very rapidly and causes all kinds of problems. And the last system, which is typically installed at about 40 to 50 employees, is called Human Capital Acquisition and Development, or HCAD for short. HCAD is about controlling your culture. It has brand components in what your brand should be. There's some great stories and case studies that we'll go through about why big companies are successful and what they do in terms of managing and attracting and keeping the best people. So that's a system that, as all of these systems, goes across the whole business and influences the whole culture and allows you to tune your business as it grows. So those 6 systems will be installed somewhere between 7 people and 50 people when there's the most rapid rate of change in a business. And I founded AirTight Management and my previous company, C-Level Enterprises, simply because I realized most people didn't realize how much the style of management and the systems of management need to change as a company grows and shift gears. We actually, this is just a reference slide that has the 6 systems summarized. We actually use a diagram like this to show that all of these systems sit on top of every discipline. It does not matter whether you're a manager in software development or marketing or sales or operations or finance or manufacturing. All of these systems are generically applicable and abstracted at the strategic level to be used in the whole business. And that's one of the things that makes AirTight Management very unique. Unlike some of the other systems out there that are pieces of the puzzle, this is a complete closed system that goes across every layer of the business vertically and every department or division of the business horizontally, and it creates a standard to be able to scale and manage the business and really generate a lot more competitive advantage that's sustainable for the business in every area of the business, because competitive advantage does not just come from the product. It comes from good marketing and messaging. It comes from better sales strategies. A competitive advantage can be garnered from almost any area of the business, and these tools will help you do that to optimize the business in many ways. We use a 5-stage growth model of business, and we'll talk about shortly how important models are to get people aligned and communicating well and to have a language. The first stage of development of a company is a raw startup, and the indicators of that are typically you're between 0 and 50 people, more often 0 to 10 people. But in the internet bubble, and if you're very well financed or you're a spin-off of a larger business, potentially you could start with a lot more people and a lot more capital. You still have to go through the process of figuring out your markets. So some indicators that you would be a startup would be your innovation and what your product is and figuring out your value added in the marketplace is your main thrust. It's really what's called proving the USP, or the unique selling proposition in the marketplace, and what your value add is in the marketplace, as well as how to sell that and various other components. There's always a lot of unknowns at this stage of development, and you've got to acknowledge that those things are unknown and be doing tests. Everything is pretty fragile. Things are going to change very rapidly. So any of those indicators mean you're a raw startup. Every new product launch or every new division launch actually goes back to being a raw startup, even if it's a part of a larger company, and you need to kind of shift gears within that skunk works or within that product launch division and act like a startup even though you might be part of a larger company. Early revenue means you've delivered product to companies, been paid for it. You're still optimizing, improving your value proposition, but there isn't a sustainable, profitable business there yet. And so you've got to both scale the business and optimize the business in every area of the business: sales, marketing, finance, product operations, and marketing or whatever still need to be optimized, and you need to create feedback loops to improve the business in every area. Once you're into stage 3, and we're going to delve down and drill down into each of these stages in much greater detail, give you a lot of references, a lot of metrics to interpolate and extrapolate from where you are today of the things that need to change as your company goes through this process. But the reason we have this is that everyone should know where they're starting, because we will be referencing these stage names through all of the AirTight Management courses. So established, typically you're $500,000 to $50 million for a company to be in that stage. These numbers are very broad because depending on the industry, they'll vary significantly. You might be 20 to as many as 500 employees. You are probably profitable, or you know you'll be profitable fairly shortly when you get to a certain number of customers. You have a sustainable model, which has hopefully some competitive advantage. We'll talk a lot about sustainable competitive advantage, differentiation, competitive intelligence, market research, tuning your business model in ways that give you differentiation and strategic advantage in the business model segments and other segments that will be part of this very intensive course. The growth expansion stage is where you kind of have the business down to a mathematical science. You have a repeatable financial formula that will allow you to replicate what you've done and scale it so that you know if you invest X dollars in marketing, you'll generate Y dollars in sales and Z dollars in profits as the company grows. And then mature is usually a company that has all of these things figured out because it's been running for many, many years and is basically continuing to deliver what is probably a pretty steady set of products and services. But again, a mature company can be launching new products, new divisions, new businesses, or spin-offs, and need to shift back to stages 1, 2, and 3 all over again for those new product launches. This is another way of looking at the same thing, and what I'm trying to show here, although this is a complicated and abstract process, what I'm showing here is a SOHO, or small office, home office business, is pretty much always a stage 1 business. And I do say that if you're just selling your time, that's more of a job than a business. A business is something that has sustainable revenue that you can walk away from and it will keep going. If you need to be there every day to run your business, it's really not a business. It's a job for you. And your goal should be turning it into a business that has real equity value, is saleable, and is an engine of growing and creating personal wealth, as well as stockholder value and growing employees, creating more jobs and that sort of thing. If you don't want to grow a significant business, you're probably in the wrong place, because most of this stuff will be about getting beyond $500,000 and $1 million in revenue to $10 million and $20 million and $50 million and $100 million. And all of these things are also applicable within divisions of multi-billion-dollar businesses. So the point of this slide is that you will go through some very dangerous transitions where, as a startup, you had feedback from the marketplace that you were doing things well, and as a result, you think you have a whole bunch of rules you can continue to follow. And what you have to realize is, to become a stage 2 company, you have to throw out a lot of the things you did that you learned were successful at that stage and begin to evolve, like a lobster shedding its shell, or a snake. To grow, it needs to shed its skin. You're going to have to give up a lot of the things you did previously to delegate, to grow, to hire more people, to abstract what you're doing, and invalidate or make your own job obsolete on a constant basis, bringing other people in. So that's a dangerous transition, and most businesses will level out and go flat somewhere around $500,000 to $1 million because the owner and the founder is so set in their ways they cannot adopt the things they have to adopt. And that's where I get called in as a consultant to many, many companies to help that entrepreneur and the whole management team learn to shift gears and do things different, because frankly most of these things aren't taught in Harvard MBAs and other Ivy League MBA programs. I have a lot of MBAs and PhDs go through my CEO boot camp, and they always ask me, why didn't they teach me this when I paid $150,000 to get an MBA? And the reason is most of those people work in academia and theory, and a lot of this has come from practical experience in integration of all of the best practices. And it's fairly high-level stuff. This is not going to be an easy course. There's a lot of abstract information, and I'll talk more about that later. The second transition is getting from a stage 2 company to a stage 3 company, and we're going to give you lists, checklists of the things that you have to do to move from one stage to another. We're going to give you metrics to look at each of the areas of your business to say, when I get to this metric, I'm thinking about having to change the systems or do some evolution in that part of the business. And these two stages tend to be the most difficult between stage 2 and stage 3 and 3 and 4, because there's very little material out there and very few entrepreneurs that have grown $100 million businesses that have learned this the hard way by the school of hard knocks and doing it. And of course, like me, along the way, learned through the books and lessons of many others, mentors, as well as top management gurus and their writings. So the idea is that as the complexity level of the business goes up, of course, the revenue of the business is also going up, and you'll see the number of employees. You can look and see where you are by the number of employees. This is not an exact science, because a distribution company might have 5 times the revenue per employee that a product manufacturing company does, or some other kind of sales company. So it will vary, and these are soft numbers, but if you look at your number of employees, that's at least a starting point to figure out what stage of business you're at. And as we're going through the rest of the courseware, you'll be able to figure out what the metrics are that you have to think about changing and implementing systems in your business from the 6 AirTight management systems, and when you'll need each of them. So this overview segment is really about some foundational principles, and we're making this segment available on all of the various DVDs that represent the AirTight management system of training, because there are foundational principles that will be used in all of those. Management and leadership has a lot of psychology in it, so there are some foundational principles in psychology. I want you to understand how and why some of these things are needed, because when people understand the whys, they're going to do it a lot better. A lot of this is about adding discipline and structure. If you look at books, some of the classic books like Jim Collins' Good to Great, he talks about how the great companies have both discipline and innovation. And sometimes we'll think of those things as mutually exclusive, but they're not. The companies that are going to dominate their space and grow very rapidly and generate lots of wealth for their shareholders and owners are those companies that maintain the culture of innovation, but also can overlay a discipline on that for the operations and the scaling and the financial things that are required to become a bigger company. As I said, many of these things, obviously I have experience in all of these things, but I've been able to take 30 years worth of reading all of these management and leadership and entrepreneurship texts and take all the best ideas and integrate them into the AirTight system to save you from having to read the 200 best books of the 1,000 I've read, although there's 20 or 30 or maybe even 50 that I would recommend every senior CEO and executive read in terms of the principles, and we'll get to that later. We want to review the 6 systems. We'll go a little deeper into each of those 6 systems and what its purpose is, as well as what the indications that you need these systems are, because unfortunately most people come to this too late. By the time they realize they need it, they're already behind the 8 ball and they're having problems. And so they've really got to backfill and back up a step, implement these systems before they can grow. Let's see, so other than that, we'll review the structure and science. Again, much of this is art and experience, but there is structure you can put around it to figure out what you don't know, and to be able to look at and implement the systems that you need. So this is a picture of, I believe it's an F-16 or F-15 breaking the sound barrier. And that sound barrier killed a lot of people when they didn't understand what it was to get to the point where, I guess it was the X-1 or whatever it was, that finally broke the sound barrier. So the idea here is, and one of my favorite authors is Malcolm Gladwell and the book Blink, which talks about the 4 levels of learning, and we're going to talk about that more later. But the first level of learning is unconscious incompetence, and that means you don't know what you don't know, so you're going into an area where you've got to have the discipline and kind of the mental horsepower to realize there are many things you don't know and go in there very prepared to figure those things out and to get the people on your team that are going to help you do that. So, as I said a little earlier, this is not going to be the most fun course you'll ever take. It's likely to be the toughest course you've ever taken, but it's also likely to do more for your career and more for your business than anything else. You will rewire your brain and the way you think about your business and other businesses if you get through all of this. And the level of mental growth, and we know brain plasticity, you will physically rewire your brain and your neurons to be thinking very differently. Lots of abstract thinking that happens in the cerebral cortex happening here. These are things that are unique to human beings. And some people don't have the ability of enough forethought and abstract thinking because they haven't practiced it. Those people typically won't be able to become managers and leaders unless they really start to exercise those brain muscles. Like anything difficult and worthwhile, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. This is a course, as with my CEO boot camp, I've had people come back 3 and 4 times at different stages of their own learning and their own company growth, because there's going to be so much dense material in this that you will take away different things at different times. So I'm going to encourage you to stop and pause the video and study some of these diagrams to make sure you get the principles. These underlying principles are important moving forward to understand, so that you'll be able to take on the rest of the material. That's why when you're done, you'll be really a rare and powerful individual. I would estimate that less than 0.5% of the people on the planet, or even in the United States, are going to have this level of understanding of management and leadership that you'll have at the time you're done with this course. This course, like all seminars and information, can only move you from level 1 to level 2, because level 3 requires in-the-world experience, using it and rewiring your brain. So we're trying to, as with any information product, move you from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, so that you know what you don't know and can figure it out and have a roadmap for moving forward, and build your team and various other tools that will help you ferret out what you don't know and not fail because of what you don't know. Very dense information, as I said. Liberally pause. Allow more time for an hour video. You might want to allow an hour and a half to watch it so that you can stop and think, take breaks. This is not entertainment. This is very high level, very dense content. So the roots of where AirTight Management come from, I've now had 22 years of personal experience as a CEO running companies, and 10 of that has been also consulting with now hundreds of clients that have come through my CEO boot camp and AirTight Management seminars, as well as me going in as a consultant and a CEO coach and helping companies overcome these barriers. The ideas, as I said, come from hundreds of top management gurus and top books, but the principles in here are timeless. Pretty much everything you will learn on this course will be just as good 20 years from now and 30 years from now as it is today, because this information doesn't change. Like most management principles and leadership principles, it's about human beings and figuring out the psychology of human beings, whether it's management or leadership or marketing. So this information is very timeless, and it will help you for your entire career. As a matter of fact, I'd keep the reference book that comes with this course available, and we're going to give you plenty of tools to go back into the appropriate sections at the appropriate time to index this very dense set of information. But most importantly, the AirTight management systems, these have been proven since I started my first company in 1989 right up until today. And I'm always learning, like everyone else should be in their career, and adding to this. But everything you will learn here is a time-tested principle. This isn't theory. This is practical, street-proven, street-smart stuff. And it provides the correct level of bureaucracy. One of the problems is that as companies get bigger, they get much less efficient. As a matter of fact, I coined a term called corruptocracy, because when a bureaucracy has more than 5 or 6 layers, it starts to have a lot of signal loss, and they lose focus on the overall mission because they see so little of the overall company and what's going on. And so AirTight Management will help you install all those things that have just the right amount of bureaucracy to prevent that signal loss and that sort of corruption of information and processes that happen as a company gets bigger and bigger. Cultural advantages. AirTight Management is actually a win-win for the company and its employees. I always try to structure win-win deals. I believe there's always going to be karma, and that when you give to people, you will get back. It's part of the law of attraction and other human psychology and behavior. And so I want to approach any relationship with an employee, a joint venture, or even the marketplace in general with a win-win approach. We're here to add value, and hopefully we share in the value we create in whether we're working with an employee or another company. So AirTight Management allows executives and managers to grow to their own limits, and of course that's going to be a function of how much employees are willing to invest in themselves and grow. They've got to rewire their brain, they've got to take courses like this and grow, and they've got to get more experience in whatever their specialties are. AirTight Management allows everyone to understand what's expected of them by creating a lot of accountability within the business, and loops, but kind of closed feedback loops to make sure that when things aren't going well, they become visible. And you have this Darwinian pressure or selection pressure for things to self-correct because of that visibility. AirTight Management allows the people who perform the best, because it's a Darwinian meritocracy. The people who perform the best will have the most opportunity for growth, and they should be making the most money, outsized payment for outsized performance. And that's always part of most good cultures. AirTight Management also makes it clear where there's failure occurring and waves red flags in the business, so that way in advance of something becoming a serious problem, you have trend indicators and advance warnings that management and executive focus are required in a certain area of the business. And that in itself can be a huge strategic advantage in a marketplace if you know something in the marketplace is changing a year before your competitors, because you see these trend indicators watching the right things. You're going to be prepared long before your competitors, and that's a strategic advantage that is hard to measure the value of. So I want, in this overview segment, you to have an understanding of why each of these systems is needed and when each of these systems is needed. You'll have to go through a lot more modules to understand the details and how to implement each of these systems, because this is not easy stuff. It's complicated, but it's also science that can be overlaid on any business. People will also do things when they understand why. A great story of human psychology is if you go into the copy room and there's 5 or 6 people waiting for a copy, and you cut in line because you're in a rush and get a copy, people are going to be pretty pissed at you. They're going to be upset. However, it's proven psychology that if you tell people, hey, I've got a meeting in 2 minutes, would you mind if I cut? Then they're not going to be upset by that, and you're going to have a much easier time. So it's important for people, for us as senior managers, CEOs, and general managers of business, to let people grow and understand why they have to do things so that it doesn't become robotic and they don't understand the value that they're producing. So sort of a visual diagram of how companies change. I'm using the metaphor of a boat here, obviously. A startup is a very high-speed, easy-to-change boat that has one driver, easy to change direction, easy to change speed. One person is in control of everything. That works until you reach what's called a span of control of about 7 people. Once you go beyond 7 people, it's almost impossible for any normal human being to keep up with everything that's going, and the efficiency of managing more people starts to decline rapidly. So you need to start to divide and specialize the business and have managers in a certain area of each size. And we're going to go through the math of this and indicators that you need to add management layers and all these kinds of things. This is just an overview. The second stage, or a stage 2 company, is kind of more like a cabin cruiser. You need a few crew, potentially, especially if you're in high winds and high waves. You've got to have a lot more going on. You've got to have a plan. You've got to have more communications going on. You probably need to think a lot more about the trip plan if you're going long term and not running out of gas. So your planning horizons stretch, and that's true at each of these stages for a company. You need to be looking out further and further as the company gets bigger, because the bigger the boat is, the longer it takes to change course. And then we've got a larger ship that's probably got a crew of at least 5 or 10 people to manage that and dock it and load it and all those sorts of things. The logistics are now getting much more complicated. And then when you get to an oil tanker, although you may not have a huge crew and there's a lot of automation on this boat, an oil tanker can take a mile or 2 to stop. In Massachusetts, we have helicopters flying over Massachusetts Bay to spot the whales so that the tankers don't hit the whales, because they've got to change course at least a mile before they get to the whale to prevent from hitting the whale. So as a company is in rapid growth mode and everything is systematized, you need to stretch that planning horizon and change things much more slowly, because it takes time to diffuse not only to your employees but into the marketplace as well. And then a very mature company, a good metaphor for that is an aircraft carrier. Those aircraft carriers, they're like a little city. They can have 5,000 people, hundreds of planes, hundreds of support craft, and even large supply ships and other things that have to follow them around for them to operate. So obviously the job of a captain on an aircraft carrier is extremely different from the job of a captain on a high-speed boat. And you can see those extremes very easily. But although we know that the VP of Marketing job at IBM is a very different job than the VP of Marketing job at a startup, we don't have a model for how you change and when as you go through these steps. And that's why I created the CEO Bootcamp and AirTight Management and founded these companies, is really to help people understand when and how they have to change their business as it grows. So some sample indicators. A stage 1 business, I used the metaphor of the SR-71 Blackbird, which is an amazing aircraft that we'll do a case study of in the section on innovation and product development. Startup is fast and lean. It adjusts and changes very quickly. There's limited bureaucracy and signal loss or communications problems, because you can make changes at lunch and at a water cooler conversation and meeting in the hallway. You can change what's happening really quick. It's also typically very cheap, because you don't have legacy customers and legacy products, and so you're much quicker to get new things done because you're not slowed down by that legacy. It hires JIT, which is just in time, so there isn't a lot of waste in bureaucracy and planning. Startups look for 80% solutions at less than half the price. I have had up to 14 times the productivity in a young early stage company or a skunkworks than is standard in the industry by doing all the right things and making sure they're not part of the legacy support issues and focused on innovation. There's a whole segment on skunkworks as part of AirTight Management. And startups are willing to take big risks, but those risks aren't big in dollar terms as they are in a big company, which is why the big company needs longer planning horizons and more thought and more discipline around empirical data as it grows. And that's what dashboards and all these other process loops are for that make up an airtight Darwinian meritocracy system. And so not having those legacy issues are a big help in terms of being productive and fast moving in the marketplace. And that's how a startup culture should be. A stage 2 company, once you've gotten somewhere between 500,000 and a few million and probably have 10, 15, or 20 employees, you're going to have to make some shifts. And you're not going to go from a cabin cruiser to an aircraft carrier. I have seen companies where the main executives come from very large businesses and they build a huge bureaucracy like the one they had at the large business, and that actually kills the business. You can't do that. You have to shift these things gradually. It's not like one day you go home and you're a stage 2 company and the next day you come in and you're a stage 3 company. There's a process that you're going through, checking off the things we're going to teach you that have to evolve as the business grows. So to bound this a little bit, and we're going to drill down and give you a lot more detail as we go through the other modules, but to bound some of the things that have to change, just for examples, your risk profile in a startup, you've got very high risk, but the amount of money you're betting and the loss of current customers, of which you may have none, and your brand is also very low. So you can afford to take high probability risks because the cost of losing is not that high. You can't do that in a stage 5 company. You'd be risking your brand, you'd be risking your customer base, and you really need to do things much more carefully, much more slowly, and roll them out more practically. Again, those are two extremes, and you need to interpolate in the middle depending on where your company is, and we're going to give you all kinds of tools to help you figure out exactly what that is. People factors. Each person is very critical in a startup. I've seen many startups that have died because of one bad hire selection. And if there's one problem I see at almost every company I go into, is the senior person, or the CEO, the founder, and the managers are often not capable of understanding the skill set they're hiring for, which is new, because they don't have that skill set themselves. And the story I use, the example I use there is what I call a pilot story. If you had sort of a to tell the truth scenario where you walked into a room with 100 people and their job was to fool you, to think they're pilots, if you aren't a pilot yourself, you would not do a very good job in separating the pilots from the non-pilots, okay? You'd probably fail a lot at that and not have a very good success ratio. However, now raise the bar a bit and ask yourself, could you possibly find the best pilot in the room? See, I'm a pilot, but I could only find the best pilot to the degree that I understand how to be a pilot myself. Okay? So it's very important in hiring, and we're going to give you more tools and rules and processes to get this right, because a bad hire typically is thought to cost a six-figure sum, over $100,000 in lost opportunity, lost revenue, reduced morale, wasted time, opportunity cost. In a small company, those hires are so critical that they can kill a business. In a stage 5 company that's very mature, you're going to be subject to the law of averages. If you have to hire 100 new people every month, there's no way you're going to get the best people all the time. And as the company gets bigger, each individual person becomes less critical to the overall success of the company. And it also becomes easier to hire people because they're more specialized. So it's easier to test them. It isn't their raw intelligence and innovation and creativity and work ethic and all those things that are so critical, because you are going to have a lot of people that are 9-to-5ers in a big company because they're not there for the equity and the fun and the growth, and they're not willing to work 60 and 80-hour weeks as you might have to do in a startup. So you're going to get a different caliber of person, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of people out there that want to punch a clock and want to do a very good job, but they're probably not the people you would hire in a very early stage company, stage 1 or 2, when everyone's got to put out a lot of extra effort, because that's part of your competitive advantage. Capital is, of course, very expensive and hard to get in a stage 1 company because it's risk capital. Venture capitalists typically seek an IRR, or an internal rate of return, of about 40%. That's a 40% yield on their investment. So that can be 5 times their investment over a 3 to 5 year period, or something in that range. So you're going to give up lots of equity, and it's going to be very expensive. So bootstrapping is a way around that if you can grow more slowly and have a protectable base. But as you become a more mature company, capital gets easy and cheap. You can float your own paper, you can issue more shares once you're established. And so that becomes part of your competitive advantage against the little guy, is that you can get resources and capital and people much easier. But you're not going to wind up with the level of creativity and drive and other things, unless you really work on it, and having skunkworks types of arrangements and that sort of thing. Speed and priority changes, you're getting the picture here. Lots of things have to change as you move from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. It's not just about management style. It's everything that is part of that culture in the company, and figuring out how to shift that is what will create a smooth, rapid growing company, instead of a company that goes in an S-curve, goes up and then goes sideways for a year, figures some things out, and then might go up a little more and then go sideways again. AirTight Management will help you create a smooth, rapid growth curve, and literally will allow you to dominate your market for one simple reason. Very few people know all this stuff, know how to use it, know how to do it right, and the companies that do are going to dominate their markets. Scope of goals, you've got a narrow focus in a niche market, in today's world almost always in a stage 1 company, whereas in a stage 5 company you might have a broad portfolio of products, or you might have one product that goes across a broad number of vertical markets or niche markets. So there's a much broader set of factors, and different general managers of the business or product managers are focusing on different niches or different products. Your target market needs to be very narrow in a startup, and fairly broad or a large vertical or potentially horizontal as you get to be $1 billion company or more. Communication can be instant in a small company. Communication can take many months or even years to get right and to change a culture in a larger company. Jack Welch, when he was at GE, said he gave the same speech every time all year at all the different GE plants. That's got to get pretty boring, and that's why I don't like to work at big companies. But that's what it takes to be a disciplined, multinational conglomerate. And then selling. In selling, typically you want to have multiple channels of selling. It might be the internet, it might be direct sales, it might be indirect sales through channels. And you're going to start with one of those and prove your product out and get it right and iterate. And then you're probably going to add more channels, and as you become a large company, you've probably got 4, 5, 6 different channels of distribution for your product, both direct and indirect, to whoever your customer is. So here is a great reference slide, and this might be one to copy or blow up on your copier and stick on your wall over your desk, because it's really some of the average, and of course there's no hard and fast rules because companies vary by industry, but it's kind of the averages of when you need to do certain things that are critical to the growth of your business, so you know to plan and budget and be ready to do it in advance. And I'm not going to read you all this, but this is a good place to pause and really study this. Know what stage company you are. Do you have an organizational chart that is documented that has this level? And we're going to talk a lot about the skill set matrix and organizational structures and all kinds of other things as we drill down into this. But this kind of gives you a framework of some of the key indicators for those things that have to evolve as your business gets bigger. Your strategic adjustments in a rapid growing startup might be every 2 to 4 weeks as you get new information and feedback from the marketplace to adjust your product, adjust your marketing message, adjust your sales methodologies, even change your channels. Things can change very rapidly. But that then becomes, once you're early revenue and have proved yourself in a marketplace, those increments become smaller. So it's sort of like launching a heat-seeking missile. Initially, the missile is making big changes, but as it gets closer and closer to the target, its changes are much smaller and more incremental as it focuses in on that known target. And what you don't know in a startup starts to get clear in these stage 2 and stage 3 things in terms of your best customer profile, what the selling pitch is, what the best channels are, the features that you need to add to win in that marketplace against competition, et cetera, et cetera. And as you become a rapid growth company in stages 3 and 4, you're probably going to update your strategic decisions something like quarterly to every 6 months. Ultimately, as a mature company, which is, a large company is typically defined as 1,000 employees or more, then you need at least, a 1-year kind of cycle for communications and planning. So this is a simple concept that as the company stage evolved, the amount of delegation and trust must also grow. And what I found is most successful startup entrepreneurs have a very dictatorial, hands-on micromanagement style. And they do that because they must. Those are the entrepreneurs that are watching the cash flow, understanding the customer, have the whole vision in their head, understand everything about the business and what they're launching into. But as a company gets to stage 3 and stage 4, there has to be a lot more delegation and trust of the management team and more specialists brought in. And this is where a lot of entrepreneurs fail, and they go into this failure zone because they don't learn to trust and delegate managers within their business to let the business grow bigger. They micromanage everything. And you're going to learn about 5 styles of management: micromanagement, management by objective, which was created by Peter Drucker, one of the fathers of management by exception. And the key tool of that is the dashboard that allows you to run the business sort of on autopilot by the numbers. Management by wandering around, which is what short circuits the bureaucracy in a company and makes sure signal loss isn't happening and the organization remains efficient, non-political, and honest. And then leadership, which is a whole other level. And you have to learn those in that order. We all learn micromanagement right from childhood because it's just direct interface with an individual. But moving to management by objective and management by exception, these can typically take a year or 2 or even 5 to get very good at because these are arts. They're not clear sciences where there's a whole bunch of set rules. It's about people, and there's always unknowns and yet probabilities when you're dealing with people. So if your trust and delegation does not go up as an early stage entrepreneur, you can blow up the company or you can go sideways forever. So the other end of the spectrum from dictatorial is collaboration. So companies and entrepreneurs have to learn to create a collaborative culture where problems are attacked with an innovative process so that a good manager or a good executive will come to an entrepreneur outlining a problem, but also having proposed solutions, having collaborated with the specialists in that area of the business before they even brought that problem, unless it's an emergency, to the CEO or senior management team. And that's one of you'll see a list of the differences between managers and executives, what we call our employee development ladder. And there's about 20 things that you have to add at each level as you grow your own career. And very few people get to the executive and leadership levels, and you'll see why in further modules when you see that list and how sophisticated and complex these things are that the average employee doesn't really understand. So, good example to think about is the same characteristics, the same personality characteristics that have a positive connotation in an early stage startup company will have the same behavior has a negative connotation. It's very bad in a stage 3 or stage 4 company. So in a 5-person startup, hands-on would be a compliment for a CEO. But start putting that in a 100-person organization or 20 or even 30, 40, 50 people, and that same behavior becomes can't let go or can't delegate, which of course is a negative connotation. Detail-oriented is very good when you're micromanaging everything and have 7 people or less under you, which is the limit of span of control. But that becomes obsessive and a micromanager too detailed oriented and slowing things down if the company is growing. Frugal, becomes a good thing to watch cash flow early on, but you have to be able to make bigger expenses and let that risk grow, and there will be more waste in a bigger organization. So you have to let some of that happen for the company to be able to grow as you delegate. People will only learn by you giving them the opportunity to learn, and you've got to let them learn some of those lessons as the company grows. So in control and control freak, again, same behavior, different environment, small or medium-sized company. Micromanager, Eisner, the past CEO of Disney, was known to have, the story goes, been in the editing room of the Lion King movie because it was so critical at the time to the success of the company for some reason. I don't know whether that's good or bad. What I do know is he probably wasn't the best editor because that's a specialty art, but he was there overseeing it, I guess. So that would be a negative description, typically, of a large company manager to be in and doing things at that level of detail and that level of specialization. And of course, a product visionary is something you have to be to identify an opportunity for a new startup company. But as you become a big company, you can't be a product visionary. You have to be an industry visionary. You have to be a strategic visionary to know where a marketplace is going to go. So this is why lots of management and leadership training fails, okay? Most of the books out there today, most of the seminars and training courses, the information you get is not stage specific. It's watered down. And the very same advice, which could be perfect for a startup, could be deadly for a stage 3 company, and vice versa. So it's very important to be able to interpolate and know where the author or the seminar speaker is coming from in terms of the situation. Whenever I interview people, I always find out how many people were at their company, because that title is meaningless without knowing the context of how many people they were managing, how much of that they were doing themselves versus had staff to do it. So another example of things that must change is the focus of leadership as a company grows. In a raw startup, you're expected to have a strong vision of the product and the market you're going after, lots of attention to detail to figure out what that product is and as you launch. But once that initial product is in the marketplace, your attention and the intellectual capital of management and founders has to change to the selling process. Now, is our messaging for marketing right and lead generation correct? Is the sales closing rate sufficient for us to have a sustainable revenue and profit stream? Your shift in stage 2 is really all about sales and marketing. And then in stage 3, It's installing the professional management systems, because now you have your proven product value proposition in the marketplace, you have your proven marketing and sales formula, and hopefully what I call a virtuous financial circle. As I said earlier, so you know X dollars in marketing will generate Y leads and Z dollars in profit, so that you have something that you can replicate and scale that's sort of mathematical. And of course, you've got to have the training systems to bring in the people to do more of that. But AirTight Management, before you can be a stage 3 company, you need to install at least the first 3 systems of AirTight Management, and ideally you'd install all 6 if you're at the 30 to 50 people kind of range. As you go into growth and expansion, you have to have all those systems tested and laid out with lots of information going on. And then as a mature company, you know, the CEO and the senior management are doing a lot of long-term planning, a lot of strategy work. There's outside communications, there's political stuff happening. And again, I don't like to work at mature companies because too much of the resources wind up going to things that don't provide value to customers. Some other indicators of stage. Stage 1, again, hands-on, micromanagement, and a product selection focus. It's okay to be a control freak, paranoid, distrustful, even dictatorial. At my first startup where I was a CEO, they called the company a benevolent dictatorship. And I took that as a compliment, because I had my fingers in every pie to make sure we figured out the product was right, the target market was right, our ideal customer profile was right. All those things, they're necessary to move to a stage 2 company. But as soon as those were right, I had to delegate, step back, and start doing management by objective, which is a monthly process of checking on people. And most people don't get that right. So you are going to learn in AirTight Management System 2, the Performance Accountability and Merit System, you're going to learn a lot about MBOs, and we have all the support files on a data disk that help you implement this very easily with fill-in-the-blanks forms and training for the individual managers that are going to use it, etc. Now, there'd be some micromanagers. The managers themselves are still doing micromanagement of the individual contributors, but the executive team and the senior managers should really be doing only management by objective at that point. And as you become a stage 3 company, which is probably getting to 25, 30 employees for most companies and most industries, you've got to have your dashboards in place so that you can manage the business by the numbers and be doing management by exception. As a senior manager, everyone will continue to do MBO, management by objective, as that's the core blocking and tackling of management. But you've got to add this layer as you add a second layer of management in an organization once it exceeds somewhere between 25 and 50 people. So you need to be focused on the sales pipeline and the sales and marketing process for capturing leads, nurturing those leads and closing those leads. So marketing is your key challenge and unknown, and that's a big risk in most businesses today. Even if you have the best product in the world, if you don't know how to market and sell it right, you're going to fail. And then once you're at stage 3, you're making those processes repeatable, you're documenting them well so you can train them, you've identified the right kind of people that you can bring in place to make them happen, and you're moving to stage 4. A leader is really doing a lot more inspiration of the vision, long-term planning, communications to the outside world, working with industry leaders. Of course, this is where you're starting to go to the point where you're a $50 or $100 million company typical, but you're at that rapid growth phase of what the venture capitalists call the hockey stick curve, because stages 1 through 3 require learning and testing and iteration to figure out getting the business model and the business formula down right, whereas stage 4, you're throwing the throttle full speed ahead, because you've not only figured out the product and the sales and marketing and the target markets well and the messaging, but now you're building the systems to train people to come in so that you can, as my business did, go from 12 people to 100 people in a single year And that's going to kill a lot of companies by diluting the expertise and driving the management crazy if you don't put the training systems and management systems in place to be able to handle that stress. So I mentioned these a little earlier, but as documentation, here's a slide with the 5 styles of management that you'll learn inside of the PAM system. We're not going to teach you a lot about micromanagement. Anyone taking this course should have experience doing that and should know what micromanagement is about. It's adjusting to the individual, finding the right people, hiring the right people, and overseeing people that need to be watched on a daily and weekly basis. Management by objective is a cycle that's monthly within the organization, typically monthly, to set larger objectives. And there are reasons we'll talk about in the next segment on the psychology of the mind and the brain's reticular activating system and how management by objective uses the evolutionary power of the brain to focus people and achieve more than even they know they can achieve. Management by exception is when you're getting leverage and you're scaling. You've got to have self-motivated, experienced, and trustworthy managers or senior managers and executives in place at that point. And then leadership is typically needed. Anyone that has 20 people under them, 15 to 25 people maybe, needs to have some leadership skills developed. And so every company that wants to be a rapid growth company should always have an in-house training management program, even if it's just a set of books and recommendations and a video library. There are plenty of online membership opportunities, and no one is going to make it to this level unless they're reading and learning from other people's mistakes, because they'll be making original mistakes over and over again. So you've got to have people that are self-actualized if they're going to be a senior person in a rapid growth company. They've got to be always working on improving themselves, because the company can grow much faster than the person's career and experience. And it's a pretty rare person that can keep up with a very rapid growth company and even hold on to that title. If you were the VP of marketing at a $1 million company, you're probably not qualified to be the VP of marketing at a $50 million company. And so if that ride for the company happened in a couple of years, odds are the company would have to bring a different, more senior, more experienced person, and the old VP of marketing would have a narrower set of responsibilities because they can't get 15 years of experience in the 2 years that the company grew that much. Just a little more detail on that. Micromanagement, most any new employee is going to start there, because you have to synchronize and have the right cadence of talking to people and understanding where their limits are. So even a senior executive coming in for the first month or two, you might micromanage them to make sure you understand where their limits are and that they know when to come to their superior for help, etc. Management by objective, it can be weekly, but typically there's a monthly and quarterly cycle that's part of connecting the strategic plan with the day-to-day work and monthly MBOs that happen. And again, we provide all the forms and diagrams, and you're going to learn about that in the whole AirTight Management course. Management by exception, that's the example of that is General Patton, is told to take Africa, okay? So General Patton was someone that had so much experience, the president could trust him to budget the resources he need, generate the strategy, go take all the strategic hills that needed to be taken to form a beachhead and get into Africa, and then do the campaign to conquer all of Africa. And so people that are managed by exception have to be very senior people, typically senior executives that have 15 or 20 years experience. And leadership, as I said, anyone with more than 20 people ought to have some leadership experience, but the bigger the company gets, the more critical it is to hone the leadership skills. The difference between leadership and management is that management is a contact sport that's one-on-one and using goal setting and MBO processes to determine what someone's going to do. Leadership is when you don't have to look behind you to know everyone's following you, because you know they have faith, and you don't even have to look back because you know they trust you enough to follow you. They believe in your vision, they believe in your abilities, and you've proven to them and sold to them that you have those abilities, so they're willing to follow you, into the fire or into the risk of a new market, a new product, and everything else. So there's a very different, and of course leadership is something you broadcast. It's not one-on-one interactive. It's more of putting out the message, the strategic plan, the vision, the policies, the rules, what the culture of the company will be. And we'll have several segments in human capital acquisition and development and PAMs about the differences and changing your thinking and giving some structure around the different levels of management and leadership. So the 6 systems, this is just a reference slide. I'm not going to read this to you. But what it shows is where each of these 6 systems contribute and what they do at each of the 3 main management styles. So as it shows here, dashboards are the major tool to allow an executive team to manage by exception. MBO is really the core of management, and it's always used at all levels in all departments to some degree because it's about the psychology of management. Other things that have to go up: delegation, collaboration, trust, we talked about in one of those diagrams already. The management quality, the quality of the people you recruit has to get better, and they have to have more experience as the company gets bigger because they're going to have more scope and more people and more risk. You have to use documentation and define processes better as the company grows, and you have to have more accountability and authority. There's a great book by Peter Senge called The Fifth Discipline, and the principle in that book is any system that gets complex separates cause and effect in both time and place, okay? And what that says is, as a company gets bigger, it's really hard to put your finger on what's wrong because you often see symptoms and people fix symptoms instead of tracing them back to root causes, which is much more difficult. So AirTight Management allows you to flag and see all of these root causes by having total accountability and authority. And that actually, even though that sounds, sometimes employees don't want accountability, quote unquote, once they have it, they realize that the good employees are benefiting from it and they're able to grow more and have more decision authority. Of course, the bad employees, it becomes very visible that they're bad employees and they're not going to like it, but that's life and that's growth, and they've probably got to move on to some other career or company. You want to send those people to your competitors. Each of these is a spectrum, not binary, and they all have to grow and change slowly. Key principles of the limits of growth. I mentioned briefly the span of control. There's a great book called The Mythical Man Month, and how adding people to a project has diminishing returns after about 7 people, because the 7th person requires more communications overhead from the other 6 than they add in overall value. And so typically you break up units or groups of people working on the same thing into 7 or less. And that same magic number is how many people a good manager can manage and still have time to do some things that they need to do to stay on top of their department or their group's project. Communications is critical. This idea of signal loss, if you ever played that party game where you whisper 7 words in someone's ear and it goes around the table and comes out and sounds completely different, multiply that times 7 layers in an organization or 30 people that might be talking and handing the same information down the line. This is why we have broadcast leadership, so there isn't signal distortion. The layers, scope, complexity, and clarity of communications has to be a process and a system, and that's what PAMS is for. Aligning objectives and time frames needs to be done, and project sizes will stretch and get bigger and have more risk and more time as a company gets bigger. Systems thinking, I mentioned Peter Senge's excellent book, The Fifth Discipline, which is on my top 20 list of things to read. And everyone must work to replace themselves and abstract their job or move up a level if a company is in a rapid growth environment. You also have to flush politics out. I make it very clear to my team that if they don't disagree with me, sometimes I don't need them. So I want a certain level of friction. I want people to be comfortable pushing back. I want people pounding on the table for what they believe in. The last thing you want in a high growth company is to have a CEO or even executives be surrounded by sycophants that just tell them what they need to know. This is why we have management by wandering around, which allows the president to have dinner with a shop floor person and get the truth, so that people don't sugarcoat information as it goes up through the levels. You would be amazed at the number of CEOs in big companies that have no clue what the main problem in their businesses are, because they're isolated by 3 levels of people that sugarcoat the information more and more, and they've turned a bureaucracy into a corruptocracy. So this is a picture of my old sailboat, and this is the starting line. This is one end of the starting line, and I think the other end, the other boat or buoy, is blocked by one of those sailboats. But this is within the first few seconds of the race. And you'll see that this sail is not pulled in. We have already lost this race because of one person that did not do their job. We're seconds into the race, and there's no way we're likely to recover unless every other boat here makes mistakes. Okay? I'm at the helm, looking at the overall environment and driving the boat. What's the wind? What's the indications on the water of the wind? Where are the other boats? Do we have right of way? I'm working on the strategy. One person lost that race for us because they were not on top of it before the finish line and didn't get that jib sheet in fast enough. And that's what can happen in a business. You're only as good as your weakest link in this. And so I tended to win the long races where rapid crew and crack crew were necessary, and lose the short races where you had to have an absolute crack crew and spend your life sailing. This is, I had mentioned this as the S curve a little earlier, and this is a very common thing where businesses will grow to 500,000 or 1 million and a 2 million, and they will plateau because the executive team or the owners either become fat, dumb, and happy, and they've made enough money so that they can stay there and be happy, or they refuse to change their style of management. And so that's why we call these success traps. These people can be successful, but they're never going to grow a world-changing, market-leading, industry-leading business if they don't learn how to shift these gears in management style and install the management systems that are necessary as company gets bigger. Most big companies will have figured these systems out over many, many years, little by little, through lots of blood, sweat, and tears and mistakes. You have the opportunity to install these just in time or just before you need them, so that your business does not get caught in these traps and have lost opportunities which your competitors will seize because you're growing smoothly and hopefully exponentially. So some of the classic growth mistakes that companies make, stages 1 to 3, running out of cash because of poor projections. It always takes longer than it does, as they sometimes say. It always takes more money than you think it will take, so you've got to be very conservative in both strategic budgeting as well as strategic planning of key factors that are going to influence where the company will be in the marketplace at a certain time. Failure to adjust the culture, we've talked about that. Systems 5 and 6 will give you the solutions and the structure for that. Trusting too many outside experts. Unfortunately, most consultants come from a big company management consulting environment where they do it right in a big company way. You really got to think about, can those people, can those experts adjust their style, and have they done it for small companies? Because many of these consultants will come in and tell you to spend a fortune that the company doesn't have, or do things very inefficiently, or as I said earlier, build a large infrastructure without growing and iterating and testing because you can't just throw money at things that you don't know work, at least not on a significant scale. You do frugal experimentation, and the number for that will change depending on the size of the company. We'll talk more about that later. Hiring mistakes. Maybe this should be number one in this list, because the most common cause of failure or lack of growth that I see in almost every client that I come in and be a virtual executive or a CEO coach or a co-CEO or an acting CEO, virtually all of those companies are failing because they don't know the right kind of people to hire, because they don't take the stage of development into account, and they don't take that pilot story into account, where if they don't get help, they can't possibly figure out who the best person is that has skills they don't have themselves. And they fail to shift gears quickly enough to the next stage. So all of these systems are helping you do that in every area of your business. Other growth mistakes that are very common: not adjusting and controlling your culture. Your culture is something that you need to control and set. And there's one of my favorite stories is that of Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines outperformed almost every other company in the world, never mind just inside the airline industry, as deregulation happens. They grew very rapidly. They decided to have a short haul strategy where they weren't competing against the big guys on price. They decided to have one single plane to lower their maintenance costs and their training costs for their mechanics and their pilots. And they decided to have unassigned seating. And all of these things lowered their cost and allowed them to be a low-cost provider. But what they realized is that people would feel like cattle with unassigned seating, and so they needed to inject some fun and some happiness into the whole process. And so what they did is they made Herb Keller, famous for this and one of the top CEOs of all time, would put on party hats and dance on tables and do all kinds of silly things that most CEOs would never think of, because his corporate culture, to execute that strategy, had to be one of fun. And unbeknownst to most people that go into Southwest Airlines for a grueling one-day interview, one of the major indicators, if not the major indicator, of whether you will get hired is the percentage of time you spend smiling that day. Now think about that. That sounds a little weird, but you cannot teach people to be fun and happy and have a good personality. You can teach them emergency procedures and how to serve Coke when a plane is at 30,000 feet. So they set up a brand filter at the door that says, we're only going to hire people who can be fun, because that's part of our brand and what we deliver to the marketplace. So I'm not saying that that's your brand, but I am saying the hiring process ties into the brand, because you need a certain type of people that you want to hire to deliver whatever your value added is to a given marketplace. And so going through a half-day branding exercise, which I do with clients all the time, and it can be done in a half day. You don't have to spend $50,000 or $100,000, that a professional branding company might charge you. This is not that hard a process. There's a great book called United We Brand that has a process in there. But you also need an outside facilitator for this, because you're too close to your own company to figure some of this out. But when I say brand, I mean also the culture, not just the stuff, the messaging, the logo, the letterhead. I mean the culture of the business and who you allow to be part of your business. A lot of companies diversify away from their core values and competencies and lose in new markets. A lot of companies don't plan ahead because the IT needed for their business to scale is not as scalable, and they need 6 or 12 months to change something, and they're not doing it because they're not used to planning that far ahead for things as a small company. A lot of companies will fail with geographic expansion because they have not systematized their existing business well enough to be profitable and successful. And a lot of companies will fail because of breakdowns in communications. And you'll see a diagram in PAMS of all the meeting cadence that you need to connect your annual strategic planning process with your day-to-day operations. And when you add up all those meetings, it's 5.4% of a manager's time. So we're not talking about a lot of overhead here. We're just talking about the discipline to make sure the communications that are happening or that need to happen are happening. A few other problems: rapid dilution of management talent, time, and expertise, insufficient hiring of new management, planning ahead of the curve because it takes longer to find the high-quality people or the higher paid, more long-term employees that are going to have 15 and 20 years experience. The clouding of accountability and authority. Many companies that are small don't have an org chart. You should always have an org chart. There is no accountability without an org chart. People need to know who to go to and who's responsible for everything that's happening in the organization. Insufficient investment in documentation and processes. This is our AirTight Management System 5. Very simple to have some simple flow charts and documentation, and that not only allows you to train and document the process, it allows you to improve it iteratively as new people come in and things change in the marketplace. Lack of managing by the numbers and having the right KPIs. Most companies cannot figure out what the right measures are. They depend on their accounting department to do that, and they make the mistake of thinking financial measures are the complete and best measures of success. They are not. Financial measures are the result and the outcome of abstracted things that are happening much earlier, which have to include productivity, unit measures, ratios that won't change as the company grows, and quality measures so that you have feedback loops in all the major areas of the business. I can put together a dashboard for a corporation in a couple of hours, typically, but most companies that try to do that themselves will fail. And I have a process. You'll learn in System 3, the dashboard system, how to go through that process. But I do recommend you seek some outside help because you are too close to it and you're used to measuring certain things. And odds are half the things that you're looking at aren't there, and half the things that you are looking at aren't as important. Very important because dashboards make planning and MBO and leading indicators pop up much earlier. And not stretching out planning timelines, which we've touched on before. A few more problems of growth: legacy issues with customers. It's often best to isolate the R&D or the new product development or innovation group from the customer service group or even the technology or pseudo-technology group that maintains the product, so that the leaders in creativity, innovation in whatever your area of business is are not hampered by customer service and other issues. Obviously, they've got to be called on for support, but they're training other people and then moving on to the next generation of product. And innovation is something that we all have to do today to survive and prosper. Problems are hidden in large numbers. As numbers get bigger, there's a psychological name for this, but the numbers become meaningless. And so that's why a lot of these numbers should be ratios. So you're making sure you're maintaining in a dashboard the ratio of productivity or quality or cost per lead or whatever it is in the right department. The caution risk profile doesn't change. And a linear percentage of growth actually is exponential growth. In other words, if you grow 50% a year or 20% a year, growing 20% on 1 million is 200,000, but growing 20% on 2 million is 400,000. So there's twice the amount of people you have to hire, twice the amount of vendors, and that is exponential, and people get in trouble not understanding that there's an acceleration. You can't just straight line some of the things you're doing. You have to be ahead of the curve in planning. So where are typical leverage points? One of the riskiest places is stage 3. You need to begin to invest in the business strategy and the design and the optimization and the documentation of process in stage 3 so that you can scale in stage 4. Stage 4 is rapid growth. Stage 3 is an established company where you really know you have the right formula down, but you haven't necessarily got the formula to build units of people to execute the formula. So you've got to document and process and have trainings and systematize and have numbers to move from stage 3 to stage 4. You've got to have dedicated time. Typically, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the senior management time should go towards strategic planning and long-term thing, whether it's 1 to 3 years. Hard for hands-on entrepreneurs to do that, but they need to as the business gets bigger, and that's what separates the Bill Gateses of the world and the Warren Buffetts of the world and the Larry Ellisons of the world from the typical entrepreneur. They've adjusted, they've scaled, they've learned to put the right people in place, figure things out, and let them go, and then move on to create more products and revenue. Senior management resources should grow in proportion to revenue so that the design and the management of the business is getting enough care and attention. These things pay for themselves many times over. As a matter of fact, there's some research that shows you get a 10-to-1 ROI on management and planning meetings. There's been some studies done on that. The cost of failure is now getting higher as a company gets bigger. And so intelligent evolution is required, and I will use the metaphor of Darwin because it is not the strongest or the fastest that survive in a Darwinian environment and Darwinian theory. It is the ones that are the most adaptable to the existing environment. And so you have to build a culture in a company that's adaptable based on things that are out of your control, competitive dynamics, events that happen in the world that you have no control over. Solidifying and branding your unique selling proposition is USP. Some more focus on marketing and sales. We'll have a whole segment on marketing and sales, a whole segment on branding, a whole segment on competitive intelligence that are part of the AirTight core learning and the CEO boot camp as well. And a learning organization, that's a phrase I love. A learning organization is one that is built to automatically adapt and learn and have iterative improvement in the business as it goes. The Japanese call this Kaizen, and Kanai is an acronym for constant and never-ending improvement. And systems do that only if they have a feedback loop and can make adjustments. So other things at stage 3, better metrics to drive the business. Of course, that means dashboards. You know by now. Focus on culture and human capital. You've got to have the right hiring systems. Think of that Southwest Airlines story. What is your smiling as an indicator of the right personality and the right type of people to let be a part of your company and your culture? Frugal experimentation or skunkworks methodologies. And so the 6 systems of AirTight Management are the answers to adjust for all of these risks and changes as a company grows. They're comprehensive and they take into account timeless principles of many, I haven't counted them, but certainly well over 100 management gurus of the last century. They take into account the psychology of people, which only changes in an evolutionary time scale. That's why I say all of this information is going to be just as applicable today as in 50 years and in 20 years from now. And this stuff does not change. The marketplace and the product changes, but if you have the right strategic plan and culture of innovation, you're building a company that will adjust with these changes. Just a reference sheet of the 6 systems again. Think about and pause and think about which you don't have and where your weakest spot in your business might be today. There's no straight answer for everybody about which one you should implement first. In a perfect world, you'd implement them in this order. Depending on the size, you would, in the strategic planning kit, there's lots of tools. There's 140 files. But any given company might only use 10 or 20% of those tools for its task to get that done. So it's important to have a strategic plan to be able to build the rest of these. But your pain point and your suffering and your barrier might be not having dashboards today. Lots of companies should start with PAMs in terms of implementing management by objective. And we are finding and building a network of coaches and consultants over time for AirTight Management so that you can get people that are local that will come in and give seminars and help coach you through this. Information alone will not make you successful. Information moves you from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. It does not make you consciously competent because that requires experience in doing and might take years. So you're better off hiring